The entire Montana town thought the wealthy businessman's daughter was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. She had a college degree, a high-paying job waiting in Seattle, and a future most people could only dream about. Then she walked away from all of it. For a cattle farmer, a man with no degree, no fortune, and a ranch that was barely surviving. Her father called it foolish. Her friends called it embarrassing, and the town gave the marriage less than a year. But 10 years later, the same people who laughed were standing in line to apologize, because they had judged the farmer by what he owned, instead of who he was. A cool September wind drifted across the rolling hills of Silver Creek, Montana. The sky was bright and cloudless, and the golden grass stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun. In 2009, Mason Reed lived on a small cattle ranch just outside Silver Creek, a quiet town where everybody knew each other's names and business. The Reed Ranch covered barely 50 acres, modest compared to the larger operations scattered across the valley. It wasn't much, but it had belonged to Mason's family for nearly 3 generations. At 26 years old, Mason Reed had the rugged appearance of a man who spent more time outdoors than inside. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered from years of lifting feed sacks, repairing fences, and working cattle. His dark brown hair was usually too long to be considered neat, and a permanent shadow of stubble often covered his strong jawline by the end of each day. His face carried sharp features that looked serious at first glance, though people who knew him well understood there was kindness behind his steady gray eyes. Mason had never attended college. After high school, he stayed home to help his family keep the ranch alive. Life had taught him responsibility early. When he was 16, a severe drought nearly forced the family to sell part of their land. Watching his father struggle through those difficult years had shaped him into a practical and hardworking man. He rarely complained and almost never spoke about his worries aloud. His father, Thomas Reed, was 58 years old and looked older than that after decades under Montana's harsh weather. His weathered face was lined by sun and wind, and his hands were rough enough to feel like leather. Despite his tough appearance, Thomas was respected throughout the county for his honesty. People often said that if Thomas Reed gave his word, it was worth more than a signed contract. Mason's mother, Linda Reed, was 54 and carried a quiet warmth that seemed to soften every room she entered. She had shoulder-length chestnut hair streaked with silver and gentle blue eyes that constantly reflected concern for her family. She managed the ranch accounts and somehow stretched every dollar farther than anyone thought possible. The Reed family wasn't poor enough to go hungry, but they certainly weren't comfortable. Every season seemed tied to uncertainty. Cattle prices rose and fell. Hay costs changed unexpectedly. Equipment repairs arrived at the worst possible moments. And every month brought another payment due at the bank. Most mornings, Mason woke before sunrise, fed the cattle, repaired whatever needed repairing, and worked until darkness covered the pastures. He didn't dream about becoming rich. He simply wanted to protect what his family had built. Across town, life looked very different for Victoria Langford. Victoria was 24 years old and had recently graduated from the University of Denver with a degree in finance. She possessed the kind of beauty that attracted attention without effort. Standing 5'8", she carried herself with natural confidence. Her long blonde hair framed an elegant face, while her green eyes seemed constantly alert, as if she were always studying the world around her. Unlike many people raised in wealthy families, Victoria never appeared arrogant. She listened carefully when others spoke and treated everyone with equal respect. Her father, Richard Langford, was one of the wealthiest businessmen in western Montana. At 60 years old, Richard owned a successful mining company that employed hundreds of workers throughout the region. Tall, clean-shaven, and always dressed professionally, he had built his fortune through discipline and relentless ambition. Success had made him respected, but it had also made him demanding. Victoria's mother, Sarah Langford, was a highly paid corporate attorney known throughout the state. At 56, she maintained a polished appearance and carried herself with remarkable confidence. Her intelligence and sharp decision-making had helped her build a powerful legal career. She loved her daughter deeply, but had high expectations for Victoria's future. To most people in Silver Creek, the Langfords represented a world entirely separate from ordinary ranch families. Victoria had recently returned home after graduation before deciding where to begin her career. Prestigious firms in Seattle, Denver, and Chicago had already shown interest in hiring her. Everyone expected her future to be extraordinary. Meanwhile, Mason spent his days worrying about cattle feed and broken fences. The distance between their lives seemed impossible to cross. One belonged to a family that measured success in profits, investments, and business opportunities. The other belonged to a family that measured success by surviving another season. Neither Mason nor Victoria knew it yet. But before long, their paths would begin moving toward each other in ways neither of them could have imagined. And when that happened, the entire town of Silver Creek would have something to talk about. Victoria Langford had been back in Silver Creek for nearly 3 weeks when she began to feel restless. The quiet town that once seemed comforting now felt strangely small after 4 years in Denver. Most mornings, she sat on the wide porch of her parents' luxurious home overlooking the valley, reading emails from recruiters and reviewing job offers from major financial firms. By any reasonable measure, her future was already planned. Yet something about that future felt incomplete. One afternoon, Sarah Langford suggested that Victoria spend some time helping with a new community outreach program being organized through the town church. The program focused on assisting elderly residents, repairing neglected properties, and providing support to families facing financial hardship. Victoria agreed. She expected it to be temporary. She did not expect it to change her perspective. The following Saturday, volunteers gathered near the old community center at the edge of town. Among them was Mason Reed. Victoria noticed him almost immediately. Not because he was trying to draw attention to himself. Quite the opposite. While several volunteers stood around discussing plans, Mason was already loading lumber onto a trailer. His faded denim shirt was stained from work, and his worn boots carried dust from the ranch. He looked exactly like what he was, a man accustomed to solving problems rather than talking about them. Their first conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. "Need help with those?" Victoria asked, pointing toward a stack of wooden boards. Mason glanced up. For a second, he looked surprised to see Richard Langford's daughter standing beside him. Then he simply nodded. Sure. No special treatment. No nervousness. No attempt to impress her. Victoria found that refreshing. Most people either tried too hard around her or seemed intimidated by her family name. Mason did neither. Throughout the day, volunteers worked on the home of an elderly widow named Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor was 78 years old, small and thin with silver hair, usually tucked beneath a faded blue scarf. Years of arthritis had curved her posture, but not her spirit. She remained sharp-minded, independent, and stubborn enough to refuse help until her roof began leaking during spring storms. Victoria spent the morning painting fences alongside other volunteers. Mason spent the entire day repairing Eleanor's porch and replacing damaged boards. Nobody asked him to stay late. He simply did. When the work finally ended near sunset, Victoria noticed something. While most volunteers were preparing to leave, Mason was stacking leftover materials neatly in Eleanor's shed. No audience. No praise. No photographs. Just quiet responsibility. On the drive home, Victoria found herself thinking about him. That surprised her. Not because Mason was unattractive. He wasn't. His rugged features, steady eyes, and calm confidence made him stand out in ways many polished businessmen never could. What surprised her was how genuine he seemed. In Denver, she had met ambitious people everywhere. Many were intelligent. Many were successful. Yet most conversations felt like competitions. Everyone wanted something. Everyone was trying to prove something. Mason appeared completely different. The following week, the outreach program organized another project. Then another. And another. Each time, Victoria and Mason crossed paths. Their conversations slowly grew longer. They talked about weather patterns, ranch life, local businesses, and the challenges facing small-town families. One afternoon, Victoria asked him why he spent so much time helping people when his own ranch already kept him busy. Mason leaned against a truck and shrugged. "My father always said that someday everybody needs help." Victoria smiled. And when your turn comes, you hope somebody shows up." The answer stayed with her. A few days later, she saw another side of him. An older rancher named Harold Jensen suffered a mechanical breakdown on a remote road outside town. Harold was 67 years old, broad-chested despite his age, with a thick white mustache and deeply tanned skin earned from decades beneath Montana sunlight. Years earlier, he had lost his wife to cancer, an experience that left him quieter but deeply compassionate toward others. Before anyone else reached the scene, Mason arrived with tools and a tow chain. He spent nearly 3 hours helping Harold repair the equipment. When Harold offered payment, Mason refused. Victoria happened to witness part of the exchange. She watched Harold drive away grateful and relieved. Then she watched Mason quietly return to work as though nothing unusual had happened. That was when something began to change inside her. She had spent her entire life around successful people, but success often came with conditions. Mason's kindness did not. The more she observed him, the harder it became to ignore the growing admiration she felt. Meanwhile, Mason remained unaware of how closely Victoria had begun paying attention. To him, she was still Richard Langford's accomplished daughter, the college graduate with opportunities waiting far beyond Silver Creek. Someone whose future belonged in boardrooms and city skylines, not beside a rancher fixing fences. Yet neither of them realized that with every conversation, every shared volunteer project, and every simple moment spent together, the distance between their two worlds was quietly beginning to disappear. By late autumn, people in Silver Creek had started noticing something neither Mason nor Victoria had intended to announce. They were simply spending time together, volunteering, talking after community meetings, sharing conversations that often lasted longer than either expected. Yet in a small town, ordinary things rarely stayed private for long. The rumors began quietly. Then they spread everywhere. At the feed store, at church, at the diner on Main Street. Some people spoke kindly about it. Others did not. One Friday evening, Victoria attended a charity fundraiser hosted at the Silver Creek Country Club. The event gathered many of the town's wealthiest residents, business owners, and professionals. Victoria had attended similar events her entire life. Usually, she found them boring. This time, she found them uncomfortable. Part of the reason was Bradley Whitmore. Bradley was 30 years old, tall and athletic, with perfectly styled dark hair and the polished confidence of a man who had spent most of his life being told he was impressive. He worked as an investment consultant in Denver and came from a wealthy family with long-standing business connections throughout Montana. For years, Bradley had assumed that Victoria would eventually become interested in him. Many people had assumed the same. When he approached her that evening, his smile appeared friendly. His words did not. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time with a ranch hand lately." Victoria immediately knew who he meant. "Mason owns part of a ranch," she replied calmly. Bradley laughed. "That's not exactly what people are talking about." Victoria's expression hardened. "What are people saying?" He shrugged. "That a woman with your education and opportunities should probably aim a little higher." The comment irritated her more than she expected, not because it was surprising, because it reflected what many people secretly believed. For the first time, Victoria realized that her growing feelings for Mason would not be accepted easily. Meanwhile, Mason faced different challenges. A week later, he stopped at the feed store to pick up supplies. As he loaded bags into his truck, he overheard two local businessmen discussing him nearby. One of them was Gregory Shaw. Gregory was a real estate developer in his mid-40s, clean-shaven and sharply dressed, even in rural Montana. Years of financial success had given him confidence, but it had also created a habit of judging people by their income rather than their character. Gregory didn't realize Mason could hear him. "She's Richard Langford's daughter." His companion laughed. "Maybe the boy thinks he's winning the lottery." The men walked away still smiling. Mason said nothing, but the words stayed with him. That night, he sat alone on the porch of the ranch house after finishing chores. The cold wind moved through the pasture while distant cattle shifted in the darkness. For the first time in months, uncertainty began creeping into his thoughts. He knew exactly who he was. A rancher, a man without a college degree, a man whose future depended on weather, cattle markets, and hard work. Victoria belonged to a completely different world. She had options he would never have. Cities, corporate careers, international travel, opportunities far beyond Silver Creek. The more he cared about her, the more one question troubled him. What if everyone else was right? A few days later, Victoria invited him to join her for coffee at a small cafe near town. The conversation began easily as usual, but eventually she noticed something had changed. Mason seemed quieter, more distant. Finally she asked, "What's bothering you?" He looked down at his coffee cup. For several seconds he considered avoiding the question. Then he answered honestly, "You ever wonder if people are right?" Victoria frowned. "About what?" "About us." The words hung between them. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window. Mason forced himself to continue. You've got a degree. You've got opportunities all over the country. You could build any life you want. Victoria watched him carefully. And Mason exhaled slowly. And I don't want to be the reason you give any of that up. For the first time, Victoria understood the fear he had been carrying. It wasn't pride. It wasn't insecurity. It was concern. He wasn't worried about what people thought of him. He was worried about what his life might cost her. That realization affected her deeply, because the more she learned about Mason Reed, the more she realized that everything people criticized about him was exactly what made him different. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't trying to benefit from her family's wealth. He wasn't trying to change who he was. He simply cared about her happiness more than his own. Outside the cafe, winter continued settling over Silver Creek. Inside, neither of them knew what the future would bring, but both knew something important had changed. Their feelings were no longer a possibility. They had become something impossible to ignore. Winter had settled heavily over Silver Creek by the time the email arrived. Victoria opened it late one evening in the study of her parents' house. Snow drifted against the windows while the fire crackled quietly behind her. The message came from a financial consulting firm in Seattle, one of the firms she had interviewed with months earlier. They were offering her a six-figure salary, relocation assistance, bonuses, and a clear path toward a senior analyst position before she turned 30. For a moment, she simply stared at the screen. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had once imagined for herself. The next morning, Richard Langford found her reading the offer again at the breakfast table. He looked unusually pleased. "This is the kind of future I hoped you'd choose," he said. "Seattle is where your talent belongs." Sarah agreed more gently. "You worked hard for that degree, Victoria. Opportunities like this don't come twice." Victoria nodded but said nothing. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, people throughout Silver Creek assumed she would leave. Some spoke with admiration. Others spoke with relief, as though the situation with Mason would resolve itself naturally once she moved away. Mason heard about the offer from Harold Jensen. Harold leaned against the fence outside the feed store and said, "Sounds like she's headed for the city." Mason managed a small smile. Maybe she should. Harold studied him carefully, but didn't press further. That night, Mason sat alone in the barn after feeding the cattle. The cold air smelled of hay and dust. He tried to imagine Victoria living in Seattle, glass buildings, crowded streets, people in suits, opportunities everywhere. It fit the world she had been raised for. He told himself he would accept it if she chose that future. He also knew it would hurt more than he wanted to admit. A few days later, Victoria asked him to meet her near the ridge overlooking the valley. The snow had stopped, leaving the landscape bright and silent under a pale winter sky. Mason arrived expecting goodbye. Instead, Victoria handed him a printed copy of the job offer. "I turned it down." He blinked. "What?" "I declined the position." Mason looked at her as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Victoria, that job is worth more than this ranch makes in years." "I know. Why would you walk away from it?" She held his gaze. "Because I realized something. I don't want a life that looks impressive from the outside if it isn't the life I actually want." Mason was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want?" "I want to stay." The wind moved through the dry grass around them. "I want to build something here." Mason shook his head slowly. "People are going to say you're making a mistake." "They already say that." "And your parents?" Victoria smiled faintly. "They're disappointed. But this is my decision." For the first time, Mason understood that she wasn't choosing him because she lacked options. She was choosing him despite having every option. The following months brought practical changes. Victoria began helping with the ranch books. What she found surprised her. The operation wasn't failing, but it was being run almost entirely by instinct and habit. Expenses weren't tracked carefully, feed costs fluctuated without planning, and several profitable opportunities had been overlooked simply because no one had time to analyze them. She created budgets, organized records, and built simple forecasting spreadsheets. Mason resisted at first. "Feels strange putting the ranch into charts." Victoria laughed. "The cattle don't care about spreadsheets. The bank does." Slowly, he admitted she was right. They also started exploring direct sales to local restaurants and specialty meat markets. Victoria handled negotiations and contracts. Mason handled production and operations. Their skills complemented each other in ways neither had expected. Over the next 2 years, the ranch began changing. The debt became easier to manage. Pastures were improved. A new water system reduced costs. Calving losses decreased because they could invest in better equipment and veterinary support. The improvements weren't dramatic overnight successes. They were the result of hundreds of small decisions made consistently. What mattered most to Mason, however, wasn't the money. It was the way Victoria treated him. She never spoke to him as though he were less educated. Never acted embarrassed by his work. Never introduced him apologetically to anyone. When she talked about the ranch, she said we. That single word changed something inside him. One evening, after finishing paperwork at the kitchen table, Victoria looked up and said, "I know people think I gave up a better future." Mason answered quietly, "Did you?" She reached across the table and took his hand. "No," she said. "I think I chose the right one." Outside, snow covered the pastures of Silver Creek. Inside, the future they were building together no longer felt impossible. Spring arrived early in Silver Creek in 2014. Snow still rested on the distant mountain peaks, but the valley below had begun turning green again. Fresh grass pushed through the soil, cattle grazed peacefully across the pastures, and the small lake behind the north meadow reflected the morning sky like polished glass. 5 years had passed since Victoria Langford turned down the Seattle job. Silver Creek had never stopped talking about that decision. Some people still believed she had thrown away a brilliant career. Others had gradually begun changing their minds. The Reed Ranch certainly looked different. Under Mason's leadership and Victoria's financial planning, the operation had become stronger than anyone expected. Debt had been reduced. Equipment was newer. The cattle herd had expanded steadily. More importantly, the ranch no longer survived from season to season. It planned for the future. Yet the greatest change wasn't financial. It was the partnership between them. Victoria had never once acted as though she were superior. She never reminded Mason of her education. Never compared ranch life to city life. Never treated him as someone who needed fixing. Instead, she worked beside him. And Mason never forgot that. One Saturday evening in May, Mason drove Victoria to the small lake beyond the northern pasture. It had become one of their favorite places over the years. No crowds. No noise. Just water, grass, and the Montana sky stretching endlessly above them. Victoria sat beside him on an old wooden dock. At 29, she had matured into a confident woman whose beauty now carried quiet strength rather than youthful glamour. Her long blonde hair moved gently in the wind, and her green eyes reflected years of experience, sacrifice, and commitment. She noticed Mason was unusually quiet. "Mason Reed," she said with a smile, "you're thinking very hard about something." Mason laughed nervously. She immediately became suspicious. That almost never happened. Before she could ask another question, Mason reached into his jacket pocket. His heart pounded. For a man who had handled frightened cattle, financial uncertainty, and Montana winters, this somehow felt harder. He stood. Victoria's eyes widened. Then she understood. For a moment neither spoke. The world seemed unusually still. Mason looked at her and thought about everything that had brought them here. The rumors, the criticism, the doubts, the years of building a life together before they even shared a home. "I don't have a speech prepared," he admitted. Victoria laughed softly through gathering tears. "That sounds like you." Mason smiled. "Good." Then he became serious again. "You chose me when it would have been easier not to." His voice remained steady. "You believed in me before I believed in myself." Victoria covered her mouth. "You've made every part of my life better." He opened the small ring box. "I don't care what people expected for either of us. I only know I want every year ahead to be with you. Victoria Langford, will you marry me?" By the time he finished speaking, tears were already running down her cheeks. She nodded immediately, then laughed through the tears. "Of course I will." Mason slipped the ring onto her finger. The sunlight reflected against the stone. Neither noticed. They were too busy looking at each other. When they returned to town, the news spread faster than either expected. The wedding took place later that summer. Nearly the entire town attended. Farmers arrived in work boots. Business executives arrived in tailored suits. For perhaps the first time in years, people from completely different social circles sat side by side. Among the guests was Bradley Whitmore. Years earlier, he would have considered Mason beneath Victoria. Now he simply shook Mason's hand and offered congratulations. Even Gregory Shaw attended. Success had taught him something humility never could. He, too, offered his respect. The most important guest, however, was Richard Langford. Age had softened him somewhat. Not completely, but enough. During the reception, he watched his daughter laugh beside Mason. He watched the way Mason looked at her, not with admiration for wealth, not with ambition, but with genuine love. Something finally shifted inside him. Later that evening, Richard quietly approached the couple. For several seconds, he struggled to find words. That alone surprised Victoria. Then he spoke. "I spent years measuring people by the wrong things." The room grew quiet. Richard looked directly at Mason. "I judged you before I knew you." Mason said nothing. Richard continued. "Money can create comfort. It can create opportunity. But character creates trust." He glanced toward Victoria. "That's something my daughter understood before I did." Years later, after Mason and Victoria had built a family together, Richard would repeat those same words to others, especially when young people asked him about success, because he had learned a lesson wealth could never teach. The strongest relationships were not built on status, not on education, not on family names. They were built on respect, honesty, sacrifice, and the daily choice to stand beside another person. And in the end, that was exactly what Mason Reed and Victoria Langford had done. They had chosen each other, again and again, and that choice became the foundation of everything that followed. Maybe that's how God works sometimes. Not through sudden riches, not through perfect opportunities, and not through the life the world tells us we should want. Sometimes God's greatest blessings arrive quietly, through the people He places in our path, through the relationships that teach us to love, trust, and sacrifice. Mason thought success meant keeping a small ranch alive. Victoria thought success meant building a career in a distant city. But God had a different plan, a plan that taught them both that real wealth isn't measured by money, degrees, or social status. It's measured by character, by faithfulness, by the people who choose to stand beside us when life becomes difficult. Maybe you're watching this today while carrying worries of your own. Maybe you're waiting for an answer, a breakthrough, or a miracle. Don't lose hope, because sometimes the miracle isn't something God sends into your life. Sometimes the miracle is someone who encourages you, believes in you, and helps you become the person God created you to be. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below and share where you're watching from. Tell us one blessing God has given you that changed your life. And if you believe kindness, faith, and true love still matter in this world, please like this video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. May God bless you, protect your family, strengthen your faith, and fill your home with peace, hope, and love. And may His grace walk beside you wherever life takes you. Amen.